On today's webinar, you'll be receiving critical information on key global trends that are occurring across the maritime sector. We'll be covering some of the trends and challenges that face us on a global basis, including countries in decline and those that are improving, where Australia sits on a global basis, and some of the key trade-offs in moving forward. Please forgive me, I tend to speak a little bit quickly, especially when I'm speaking about a topic that I get excited about, which maritime does. Today's session will be about 45 minutes long, and I will be hosting along with Dr. Jan Hoffman of United Nations Conference Trade Delegation. We have a lot to get through, so with your permission, we're going to move quickly and we will take questions at the end of the session. We've actually got a bonus for you today too. We have the presentation from Jan's webinar, all of his slides, and the recording of today's session available for you as attendees. And because we're trying to fit a lot into a short time frame and we want to ensure that we give you maximum value, we're also going to be sending you a video presentation from a business specialist that we work closely with. And he will be taking the insights from Jan's presentation and applying them to a high-performance business model for you. Now, if you would like to receive these, stay to the end so you can type in your name and email into the chat box. Please do this at the end because we already have a lot of questions in from that survey. So thank you to those that answered the survey questions prior to today's session. For those of you who I haven't spoken with or met before, my name's Carolyn Cummings. I'm Director of 360 Group. We specialise in recruiting for the maritime industry. And we work with progressive clients that value their people in a multitude of areas of maritime, such as operators, ship managers, shipbuilders, ports, and especially with onshore maritime professionals in the mid to executive level positions. We work closely with industry and our clients to proactively source and develop maritime professionals. As you know, our industry is a fluctuating one and it's influenced by many factors out of our control. So we're continually pushing the envelope, not only in maritime recruitment, but also in ensuring that our candidates and our clients have access to world leaders in this industry. So with the budgets that you work with, even the smallest of changes can often mean dramatic differences to the bottom line. So today we at 360 Group want to share with you some key information that could stimulate a different way of thinking and positively affect your results. And with that, I'm very proud to announce that we have Dr. Jan Hoffman from Chief of Trade and Logistics with United Nations Conference Trade Delegation. He's been a keynote speaker globally for a number of years, written nearly a dozen papers in fields of maritime and logistics, and is a regular contributor to the International Maritime Economics magazine. And Jan joins us from Geneva this morning. Thank you, Jan.
All right, Jan, sorry.
Okay, now I am unmuted. Excellent. A wonderful good morning from Geneva, from the port of Geneva. I will now click share screen, and I guess all the colleagues from all over the world should now be seeing my PowerPoint slide. Is this correct and working? Now I cannot hear anything. I hope you can hear me. Can you confirm that you can hear me, please?
Yes, I can hear you, Jan.
Okay, and I guess the participants can hear me as well. So I'll just start. Thank you for this great opportunity. We said we would have about maybe half an hour, depending on questions, and we'll take questions afterwards, even afterwards by email or through the chat, and very happy to engage in this discussion. I also understand this is the first out of a series of presentations, of webinars, and we agree this is really the big picture which we can give from a global overview from the United Nations in Geneva, where we produce the main UN statistics on seaborne trade, on fleet ownership, on vessel registration, this type of thing. So I will run you through three chapters of my presentation: the supply chain of maritime transport, maritime country profiles, seeing how different countries specialize in different maritime sectors, and their trade-offs and synergies. Let me start with the supply chain of maritime transport. It really goes from building to scrapping, and more we find that different countries specialize in different parts of the supply chain. We no longer have maritime nations who are engaged in all the sectors. We no longer have the country where the owner, the shipbuilding, the flag, the seafarers, everything would be from the same countries, but we see how these take place in different countries, and that's really what makes it more interesting, more challenging, the globalized production of maritime transport. If we take, for example, shipbuilding, it is just 2 countries, Korea and China, who construct 70% of the world tonnage. Here I'm happy to share with you some data from our next annual review of maritime transport, which is still forthcoming, but this data I am allowed to share. You can see that just 3 countries construct more than 91% of shipbuilding. If you add the Philippines, then you find that the rest of the world, meaning the US, Brazil, Europe, Australia, India, everybody together constructs just 6% of the world tonnage. So clearly an example of specialization in shipbuilding. Then we move to the ship owners. 29% of tonnage is owned by owners from just 2 countries, Greece and Japan. It is the owners who order the ships, who have them built in the shipbuilding countries. And here also I want to have 2 quick slides on which in my view very nicely illustrate the shipbuilding cycle, how we have this tremendous boom and bust in shipping. And if you see, let me see if the pointer works. Well, I will point with the mouse. You see how in 2011, 12, 13, 2009, a lot of tonnage was built even after the economic crisis, which is due to the fact that the ships are ordered several years before they're being built. There's a time lag between placing an order and the ships being built, especially in dry bulk. You had this tremendous boom in shipbuilding after the demand had actually gone down in 2009. If we look at the ships that were built in 2014, only those ships, we can also see when these ships were actually ordered. And some of them, even those that were built now or last year, 2014, were built in 2008, and the majority were ordered in 2011 and 12. So that's a little bit like the ship owners who order the ships when the economy is going well, and then they are delivered later. The ship owners, they register the ships, they fly the flag of other countries. 42% of the tonnage in the world are registered, meaning they fly the flag from Panama, Liberia, and Marshall Islands. 42% registered in just 3 countries. And here, another chart I find interesting. You see all the growth in the world fleet is really using what we would call a foreign flag, where the flag that is the ship is flying is different from the nationality of the owner. And we'll come back a little bit to this issue of nationality later on. Now, many of the ships, especially the container ships that are operated, where we see the names put on the side, they say Maersk or MSC, or they say Evergreen or CSAV. In fact, half of them are not owned by the operators, but just operated. They are leased from the owners. You may have a German dentist fund or a Greek ship owner who then leases the ship to the operator. And here, the 2, if we take just Maersk and MSC, who's here from Geneva, I can actually practically see the offices from the other side of the lake. So in landlocked Switzerland, there's Mediterranean Shipping Company and Maersk, headquartered in Denmark, plus a few smaller companies in Denmark and Switzerland, make it that these 2 countries account for 30% of container ship operation. The owners of many of these ships, as I said, are foreign, or not foreign, are like not from the same company. So Maersk operated ships are 43.5% owned by other companies than Maersk. MSC, 57% are not owned by MSC. So again, an area of specialization. When the ships die, they go to the beach. They are being scrapped, or politically correct, often we use recycled. In India, Bangladesh, China, and Pakistan, 92% of tonnage is being scrapped in those 4 countries. In parallel, the services that are being used during the life of a ship, the financing, the classification, the insurance, they still very much come from what we would call the classical maritime countries, if you want, that in the past used to be the ones that also built, owned, and so on, operated the ships. Although even there in financing, we have of course now also China financing many ships. Classification, we have the Indian Classification Society becoming member of the ISCS, and we have insurance clubs also now, for example, in Korea. But overall, these services are still often in service clusters in Europe, Scandinavia, also US, also Singapore. The sailors, the people on board, they come mostly from Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia. When the ships then go to the port, their containers are handled by container terminal operators, which may come from Hong Kong, Netherlands, Singapore, or like Dubai ports. About a third of containers are handled by those 4 main container port operators. So this was a quick run through like on a horizontal scale, how maritime transport is being produced. Globalized production of maritime transport. The other side of the coin then is, if you look from the country perspective, how different countries specialize in different sectors. And I think this is one of the key messages I find interesting and want to share here. If a country, be it Japan, Australia, Germany, whatever, wants to see where can I make money with the maritime business, it is much less likely that you are able to make money in all the sectors, but you have to see in which subsector. Is it vessel registration? Is it repair? Is it insurance? Is it operation? Is it owning? Is it scrapping? Is it some insurance services? And there's practically no country at present that is active in all areas. We may discuss, there may be a trend now that we come back to clusters, but that's like for the third part, the trade-offs and the synergies. Let me run you through a few examples. While the industry sees a process of concentration, we see that countries specialize. So 19th, 20th century, we had the maritime nations, nationally built, flagged, operated, manned, and so on fleets. Now, last century, we had specialization, like a Greek-owned ship, Panama flagged, Korea-built, Philippine-manned, and now, well, we are moving towards, a bit more again, towards some clusters, but like with synergies, economies of scale and scope, perhaps politics, perhaps industrial policies. So are we going back to maritime nations? Perhaps a topic for discussion. Let me run you through one example to start with, Malaysia. Malaysia has about a similar share in the world population as it has in the world's income, which tells us you have like average GDP per capita, so an average income, average level of development among the 200 or so countries in the world. Malaysia is average in that sense. Malaysia is a very open economy. Its share in trade and goods is much higher than you would expect from its share in population and GDP. So it depends very much on foreign trade, on ships, on its ports. It's more open than the average country. It has slightly less ship ownership. Its share in ship ownership is slightly less than its share in trade, meaning at least some of its foreign trade is certainly moved by ships that are owned by non-Malaysians. And in fact, we know also that a lot of the Malaysian ship owners do not transport Malaysian cargo, imports, exports, but they move other countries' cargo. So there's increasingly a de-link. It is no longer that your own country's ships move your own country's cargo, imports and exports. The Malaysian-owned ships only to some extent use the flag of Malaysia. There only around half of them are registered in Malaysia, and about the other half use foreign flags. They may be registered in Panama or in Singapore or in Liberia. Malaysia has a very high market share in container port traffic, meaning that they have a high share in trade and goods, and even more so, a high share in seaborne trade that is containerized. So it is very much on manufactured goods and not so much, say, exporting oil or exporting iron ore. So for Malaysia, the container port traffic, this competitiveness of their ports, the access to line shipping networks is particularly important. Some of this container port traffic is also transshipment. It is also the seaborne trade of other countries that transships in Malaysian ports. Shipbuilding, very little really. We had seen the earlier specialization. Most shipbuilding takes place in Republic of Korea, China, and Japan. Some shipbuilding also in Malaysia. Malaysia is also exporting seafarers. You can see that there's a quite high share in ratings. If you compare this to the national flag fleet and the ship ownership, this indicates that clearly a lot of Malaysian nationals are working on foreign ships, on non-Malaysian ships. And last but not least, there's no ship scrapping recorded in Malaysia. That is one example. We can now move to some other examples. Before I show you the next slide, Bangladesh, if you think of Bangladesh, what would be the maritime profile of Bangladesh? Now, that was a rhetorical question. Now I move to the slide. Bangladesh, for example, has a very low GDP per capita. You see a very low income per capita in the compared GDP and population share, and it has an extremely high share in ship scrapping, which may have some relation, there's some correlation there. To be competitive in ship scrapping, you need a lot of labor, a lot of manpower for the people who do manually actually dismantle the ships. So that is Bangladesh, and the maritime profile of Bangladesh actually looks quite similar to the one of India. India is, of course, much larger, but that is not really so interesting here. The interesting is to see the market shares and compare them. And if you see the share of India in the world's population, huge market share, so to say, not so huge share in GDP, again, a relatively low income per capita compared to the world average, and again, a huge share in ship scrapping. We also see that India is exporting seafarers, including also a relatively high number of officers, not only ratings. Apart from this, compared to its GDP and its population, India is not a particularly maritime country. It is so large that a lot of its production consumption is internal. Next maritime profile I want to share is Indonesia, and it's interesting. Indonesia, in terms of, it's also a huge population. It's also below average income per capita. It also, similar to India, it's not particularly maritime if you look at its ship ownership, national flag fleet, container port traffic. Interestingly here, it's very different. Indonesia is not participating at all in ship scrapping, but it is exporting a large number of seafarers. Would be interesting to discuss why is one country more competitive in one sector, as nautical schools and so on, as a lot of Indonesian nationals work on board foreign ships. but there's no ship scrapping. China is the one country, from what I can see from our data, which is really active in all maritime sectors. Strongest, highest market share is in shipbuilding. There is probably some relationship also between shipbuilding and ship scrapping, because the steel used in ship scrapping can be used for shipbuilding. There's of course a high share in container port traffic, even more than trade in goods. A lot of Chinese exports are manufactured goods, are containerized. Still in China, if you compare it to the population, in fact, China is not a particularly maritime country. It's only in shipbuilding, ship scrapping, and container port traffic that it is higher than what its population or GDP would suggest. But it is active in all major sectors, including others that are not covered in this chart, in finance and insurance. It is, yeah, a very broad, huge maritime cluster. There is also a let's go to the next maritime profile. Japan has a very high GDP per capita, very advanced, very developed country. A lot of ship ownership, especially in dry bulk actually, and a lot of these Japanese-owned ships are not registered in Japan. They use very much the flag of Panama. In fact, the largest cluster of ships of tonnage in the world are Japanese-owned dry bulk ships registered in Panama. And Japan also still has a high share in shipbuilding. If you look at the seafarers that Japan provides, it's very much actually officers rather than ratings, which makes sense if you know that salaries in Japan are higher than world average. So it's a higher qualified seafarers that find employment, and maybe not so much the ratings, which require less education, less prior training. Japan actually has a similar maritime profile as Korea. More ownership than national flag fleet, and a lot of shipbuilding, and again, more officers than ratings. Very similar maritime profile. Singapore is different, looks different. Just visually, you see how there's a national flag fleet, there's a register. The flag of Singapore is used not only by Singapore owners, but also by a lot of other countries who register their ship in Singapore. And then, of course, you have the huge transshipment business, the container port traffic in Singapore. Thailand, very important trade, but actually largely depending on other countries' ships and not much container transshipment traffic. A lot of connections of Thailand trade go through transshipment, for example, in Singapore. United States has, compared to its GDP and population, actually is not a particularly maritime country. It has less trade in goods than GDP, and less container port traffic than even trade. A lot of its trade in goods is also by land with Mexico and Canada. It is importing bulk cargo. So overall, the United States is not a particularly maritime country if you compare it to its population and economy. Which leads me to the next maritime profile, which I understand several of you are from Australia, based in Australia. The maritime profile of Australia looks very similar to the one of the United States. Of course, the absolute numbers are smaller, but if you look at the shares, the market shares, very similar. A lot of trade in goods, more than Australian population share, less than the Australian share in GDP. Container port traffic, yes. There's still officers, more officers than ratings, more ship ownership than national flag fleet. Overall ship ownership, national flag fleet, shipbuilding, far less than your maritime trade. So you are much more, if I say you, the Australians, are much more on the demand side. You make use of maritime services, but not so much on the supply side. And we'll come back to some Australian examples now. Looking at trade-offs and synergies. What are the decisions that have to be taken? What are the challenges? Some very specific data on Australia. The national flag fleet on 1 January of this year is 0.11% of the world total, meaning 0.11% of the world's tonnage is registered as flying the Australian flag. Almost half of the units are tugboats. In terms of tonnage, the largest share are floating production, storage, and offloading vessels. There are no Australian flagged container ships, at least from the data we manage here that we have from Clarkson's research services on the world fleet. In terms of ship building, it's much less. That's 0.004% of the world total of ship building that was recorded in our database in Australia. The container port traffic, it's a totally different dimension. It's like 10 times more than the national flag fleet. So it's much more on the demand side that Australia makes use of maritime services, but is not really providing them the nationally flagged services. On the ownership, if you go into even more detail, there's something quite interesting about the case of Australia. We can distinguish for each ship of the world, we have information, although it is sometimes a bit of a guesswork, but we have information about the ultimate owner's nationality of all the ships. Basically the passport of the owner. And here Australia has 0.29% market share. Then we also have information on what we call the beneficial ownership location. And there Australia's market share is only about half. And what our data suggests is that a large part of Australian nationals who are ship owners operate from offices in Singapore and the United Kingdom, especially in these two countries where you have the location of companies that own ships and are run by Australian nationals. That leads me to the last part. I will run through this race thoughts question, then we may have time to discuss 3 trade-offs and 3 synergies. And to some extent, policymakers have to make a choice, and to some extent, it's not a choice, but actually it's a win-win situation. What about the interests of ports versus nationally flagged fleets? Example, should a country liberalize cabotage, or called coastal shipping? Should you allow foreign owners to provide coastal shipping services? Malaysia and New Zealand, for example, have liberalized cabotage against lobbying from national ship owners. In Malaysia, it was very much the motivation to be in the interest of the port. The Malaysian ports were competing with Singapore as a transshipment port. And if you had a foreign flag and were moving cargo from some Malaysian port, you could not really transship in another Malaysian port, because then you would be obliged in the past to use Malaysian flagged ships. This is now changed, and a result has been, from the data we have, that the market share of Australian seaports has gone up, and the market share of Malaysian seaports has gone up, and the market share of Malaysian nationally flagged fleet has gone down. In New Zealand, the motivation was very much to improve the connectivity to global shipping networks. So if international lines that connected New Zealand with North America or Asia or Europe could call in the North Island and South Island and could at the same time take cargo between those two islands, that made them overall more competitive and made New Zealand foreign trade more competitive, less costly. A second trade-off, the example is which interest are we promoting more, the shippers, the users, or the carriers? And there is, as some of you know, there's been a lot of discussion in the US, in Europe, in Australia about the antitrust immunity of liner shipping companies, the so-called liner shipping conferences, which have been weakened over the last years with a view to support the shippers' interests and against the interests, against a lot of lobbying also from the liner shipping companies who had previously benefited from the antitrust immunity. Third example of trade-offs could be trucking versus shipping. How much tax do you charge for fuel? What are the duties or the fees in the ports, on the railway? And so that's often a trade-off. Also, even the environment. If you want really to reduce CO2 emissions, you certainly want to promote coastal shipping rather than trucking, which should then encourage any regime that helps promote coastal shipping. But there are also synergies. There are cases where different parts of the maritime business have the same interest. For example, you may have officers that used to work as a captain or officer on a ship and later on work on shore, for example, in a classification society. A lot of the specialists that are technical experts for example, classification societies or for insurance companies have previously worked on board. So if you don't have any officers, captains in your country left, then it will be more difficult to keep the qualified people also for certain onshore employment. Another example I'd mentioned earlier, shipbuilding, recycling. A lot of the steel that you gain from recycling is then used, for example, in shipbuilding. Another, in this context, one could also say you may benefit from, have a synergy between ships calling in your ports and then make use of shipyards for repairs in your ports. Panama, for example, benefits from its location, from its canal, and is offering also ship repair services. Third and last example beyond synergies, clusters of ship owning and services. So if you're close to the owners, it does help. London is a classical maritime cluster, Hamburg, Singapore, where you have the owners, the insurances, the brokers, the IMO in London. So a lot of financing services. There's certainly a synergy having this type of maritime cluster. 3 conclusions, thinking aloud, food for thought, nothing official here, just thinking aloud. In the long term, there is a trend that maritime sectors are increasingly located in so-called developing countries. Maritime is not rocket science. It is not the most advanced technology. It is not spacecraft or the latest cloud computing. Of course, it is not low tech, but it is a level of technology, of knowledge, of expertise that is required that can increasingly be taken, can be accomplished, can be done by middle-income developing countries. This chart I find quite interesting here. I've computed the average GDP per capita weighted by the maritime sector. So you see, it makes sense. You look at ship scrapping. So the average GDP per capita weighed by the market shares of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan is below world average. The highest GDP per capita is in the ship owning countries. Then comes container port traffic. Yes, there's a close correlation between container port traffic and the country's level of development. Shipbuilding also requires more and more certain skills. So these are very rough indicative hints of like what's your country's GDP per capita, and then you can say, okay, which sector makes sense, or what are the other countries doing that have my GDP per capita. Second conclusion, this specialization. We can identify which countries have similar maritime profiles. We can identify which sectors are likely to be located in the same country. And if I compare the different maritime profiles, these bar charts I had shown you, I'd run you through earlier, and you see what we call a dendrogram, then you see Australia has a very similar maritime profile as the United States and as Brazil, for example. Other countries that have similar profiles are Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, or Korea, Japan, China have similar maritime profiles. Cambodia, Myanmar, and Turkey have similar. So that is a visual illustration of the similarity between maritime profiles. The same type of dendrogram you can also do for the maritime sectors. You can see which sectors are more likely to be in the same countries. So if a country is a provider of officers, it is also likely to be a provider of ratings. If a country has a high GDP, it is also likely to have a lot of trade in goods and then a lot of port traffic. Whereas further to the left, ship scrapping, shipbuilding, there's hardly any correlation with the other maritime sectors. And last but not least, I'm going back to this perhaps future trend. Are we going back to maritime nations? Are we going back to some clusters? We had maritime nations historically. You were either maritime or non-maritime. And if you were maritime, you had it all. You had the shipbuilding, ship owning, and your own nationally flagged and manned ships were transporting your national trade. Then we had the specialization. This is what we see today. But there are cluster synergies, economies of scale and scope, and perhaps industrial policies. Perhaps you identify those, and then you may go back to maritime nations with a large potential, increasingly for developing countries. And I'm through with my presentation. That was about half an hour. All your chats and microphones were muted, but I guess we are now back to the possibility to engage in some questions and whatever I can answer to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jan. Yes, if we'll open it up to questions time now, everybody. So if you just type into the chat box anything that you'd like to ask, and we'll deal with those. Jan, the question box, sorry. Jan, we had some questions that were sent in before as well.
Yes.
And I have those with me. Did you have those, or did you want me to read that?
I have them with me, yes. Yeah, maybe that's a good starting point. And in fact, when I ran through the presentation, I had in mind some of the questions like, what can the international maritime community do to develop indigenous shipping tonnage in developing maritime economies? And I think what I have tried to answer here is the two things. And we talk about developing maritime economies. The good news is that a lot of the trend is towards so-called developing countries. So a lot of the shift in different sectors is towards developing countries. But at the same time, a key message here is it's difficult to talk about indigenous shipping. In general, we have to see what exactly are we talking about. Are we talking about the location of the shipping company, the flag the ships fly, the seafarers, the nationality of the owner, and yeah, it's a question of course, some clustering and some of course, tax regimes, also clustering synergies with other sectors, finance, insurance. Those who are strong in shipbuilding are also strong in some other industries like car manufacturing. I think that was one of the questions. There were a couple of questions that were more on the technology side, and I believe some of your next webinars, I think you're planning another 3 or 4 webinars, they will go more into specific technical issues. I don't dare. I'm an economist. I'm looking at statistics and politics and global trends. I have no view on micro welding or on certain specific technologies. We have some data on the increased introduction of ecologically technologies, like the latest data I have that nowadays half of new built container ships have improved a lot of eco-management for the waste, for the ballast water treatment and this type of thing. But I don't dare answer these technical questions. So that was a bit some of the first responses, success factors, surviving the shipping in the long term. I think, be realistic. Look at what are the other countries? Where are the businesses moving to? I had shown this trend that in Australia, a lot of the Australian ship owners have moved out of Australia, set up shop in UK and Singapore. There are other countries which have lost location in that sense. Italy is one of them, Greece is one of them, Germany a little bit, and then other countries have gained. Switzerland, Singapore, United Kingdom, they have a higher share as a location, meaning business moving towards these locations with the tax regimes, with the service cluster. So their share is today higher in the sector than the traditional ship owning would suggest. So that's 2 or 3 of the questions I had, and as I said, some other questions I don't really dare to answer, and some other questions are about longer-term trends on trade, on demand. That's a bit beyond the scope of this. I'd be happy to engage in some of these also later on. The participants have my email on the screen. I'd be happy to respond also to emails. And then perhaps with colleagues here in UNCTAD, we can try and answer some of these on trade growth in Southwest Pacific region or some of these issues. And last, we can, of course, go and discuss Baron Trust's proposal for an Australian International Ships Register or the coastal shipping. But then sometimes it gets very cold here in Switzerland, and I don't like walking on a very slippery ice, as I cannot say, like United Nations is making a recommendation on this or that maritime policy. But it is very, very clear that the Australian policy concerning coastal shipping and ship registration has to make quite some tough trade-offs. And I think the trade-offs I have illustrated about coastal shipping, about nationally flag, about ports interest versus shipping interest. This is not that one is better than the other, but these are choices the country and the policymakers have to make.
Jan, did you see the question here? Is the reason the likes of USA and Australia have no ship scrapping due to the tougher environmental restrictions?
Yeah, I must confess, which button do I have to?
The question one.
Click on the dashboard, I guess.
Just the arrow above the questions. Next to it.
Arrow about my apologies. Now I see a dashboard. Is it above or below dashboard? I see chat.
It's okay.
Below. Yeah, it's below webcam.
Yeah, below webcam. That's okay. I can read
really
that
sorry.
if you like. No problem. Do you want me to read the question for you again, Jan?
I see audio. Below webcam, I see audio.
Then it should have questions.
Below, I see dashboard, but I'm really sorry. I do not see
questions
right now.
Strange. Well, I'll read out some. Oh, I get to select them then. Okay. Is the reason the likes of USA and Australia have no ship scrapping due to tougher environmental restrictions?
Environmental restrictions certainly play a role in the issue of ship scrapping. Yes, I don't have data or proof on this, but yes, that is quite clear. The key point in ship scrapping is, however, I would say the labor costs, and it is there where, of course, India or Bangladesh are much more competitive. But environmental concerns are a big concern. In fact, our next review of maritime transport will have a special focus on sustainable development and environmental concerns, and I will write a few paragraphs also on the ship scrapping. That there too, that's definitely a challenge. It's it's dangerous goods. It's poisonous material. It's potentially very bad for the environment to engage in ship scrapping.
Okay. And then we have.
I hope this answers this question.
Yeah, it did. I wonder. This question here comes from Japan. I wonder the impact of history dimension. Which steps passed before Cummings